Thanks so much for having me. Very simply put, link taxes are laws designed to force big, dominant digital platforms to pay news organizations for crawling and linking to their content, or for displaying links and images and snippets of that content. They do this in one of two ways, depending on what legal theory they're using. Either they set out to create a right for publishers to demand these payments, something that would normally be impossible because either they're outside the ambit of copyright law, or things like snippets and thumbnails have over and over again been judged to be fair use of that copyright content. So, one way these link tax works is to kind of create a new right. Or they allow news organizations to band together, something that would normally be illegal, to set pricing to receive these payments. And in this case, it kind of implicitly creates a new right for publishers. So all of them are designed to do the same thing, but they set out to do that in different ways.
Great, thank you. Chris, I'm going to turn to you now. And, from the publishing side, I think there's been very, very mixed views in terms of, you know, uh, whether or not link taxes are good or bad. And there is an element certainly of publishers that are eager to get this because it means that they would get payments from various platforms. But there have been more and more publishers, including myself as well, who are concerned about the nature of these link taxes. So, can you give sort of the publisher perspective on how they view link taxes right now?
Yeah, I think I can. I think broadly speaking, the places that are pro link tax legislation are large legacy organizations who are, I don't know, financially distressed is one way of sort of talking about their, they carry heavy debt loads or they're owned by, financial instruments like hedge funds. And they seem to like think and talk about this type of legislation as if it were the internet's version of retransmission funds. They would like to get paid regularly in a recurring way. And they see this as an essential way because they're things are rough right now, right? Like there's no reliable social traffic. And frankly, probably most of them struggle with converting Google traffic into anything meaningful anyway. And so they're up against it. They're not, they've lost for the last few years those with like they were still making most of their money on print publications. But since COVID, that number's been dropping through the floor. They've lost readers, they've lost advertisers, they've lost most of the viability for their product. And so now this is a way they found a message that seems to resonate with lawmakers who are eager to, maybe not prop up legacy, but definitely eager to kick big tech in the shins. And they see this as the way they can do that. I think broadly speaking, certainly the publishers that Lion represents. Lion stands for Local Independent Online News. We have about 575 members, the vast majority of which are in the US, the vast majority of which are very small and are very reliant on Google and to some degree Meta platforms for discoverability, visibility, for that's the sort of grease that helps their engines run. And there is a divide between those of in my membership who rely on this sort of side door when somebody tries to ask why are my taxes going up, and it then stumbles upon their local news provider and becomes eventually either a subscriber or a member. That is one very viable path that I think these types of things could threaten, especially with versions of this that have popped up, whether north of the border in Canada or now sort of pending in California.
Great, thanks. So, Cathy, let me turn to you, sort of more on the legal front. I know that you've had some significant concerns about this approach to, effectively taxing the internet platforms and providing funding for the news organization. So, can you explain a little bit where your concerns come in on the legal side of this?
They're all over the place, echoing some that have come up now, but to translate that into legalese, which is, of course, what everybody wants lawyers to do. Um, the policy goal is fine. News needs to be supported somehow. But you have sort of a policy goal. That doesn't mean that just anything you do to advance that policy goal is actually a good idea. You could say we need to make sure that news is funded, and let's pass a law that everybody gets a piece of chocolate cake. That has maybe just as much of a rational attachment to what's being accomplished with an awful lot of less damage. Because what this comes down to is these news publishers, the ones who are advancing it, want to be able to say no to anybody who is in some way benefiting to what they're publishing. And they don't currently have a way to say no, and that's good. Lisa had talked about how some of what they want to say is it's beyond the reach of what like copyright would do. Copyright gives publishers the right to say no to certain uses of their works. Like it can't be copied normally without it violating the exclusive rights they have in their copyright and these monopoly powers that they have over the stuff they've created to be able to say no to anybody who wants to use and benefit. But even when copyright applies, there may also be fair use, and fair use curtails the ability of a copyright owner to be able to say no. And then what they're trying to say no to may not be something that copyright actually lets them say no to. So what they're asking for is copyright is a monopoly right that gives them this power to say no. Since it doesn't give them this particular power to say no, they need law to create a new monopoly right that they have by virtue of having created their news pieces, and on the basis of that to be able to say no. But that's not something that copyright has historically done. And it's also not something that copyright really should do because it doesn't fulfill the public mandate for copyright, which is to make sure that the public gets the benefit of works having been created. And this is taking away from the public the benefit of works having been created by building an obstruction between the public and the works. And then you also have a lot of free expression issues, and copyright has to dance with the First Amendment. And this just runs over that and the public interest and the ability for people to be able to share works and expression, because a lot of this is a very dynamic thing. If this is how people are speaking to each other on the internet, I've read something and I want you to see it. And that sort of fluidity of exchange of expression, even if it comes at the instigation of the platform, is something that, public discourse that democracy depends on having access to information. And they basically want to say no and build obstructions to that flow of expression and information. And that's got issues as well.
So, Lisa, I'm going to go back to you a little bit on this next question. One of the things that I hear a lot from the people who are supporting these laws and defending them are basically pointing out, as Chris talked a little bit about, is that news organizations are struggling, and certainly the internet companies are very successful and making lots of money. And part of the argument is that because of the nature of how the internet has shifted the revenue streams and the ways in which advertising works, it only makes sense to effectively transfer some of that money from the successful internet platforms to the news providers. And what's your take on sort of that explanation behind these kinds of policies?
Well, I'd start probably out by saying that this isn't the first time that the newspaper industry in particular has responded to technological disruption by trying to get legislative protections. So if you go all the way back to the 1930s, the so-called Biltmore Agreement was the negotiated settlement between the new scary radio industry and newspapers. When radio began carrying news, newspapers responded by keeping them away from news headlines, by trying to put all kinds of restrictions on them. They ultimately reached an agreement which fell apart within months. Similarly, in the 1970s, due to a lot of social trends and the emergence of TV carrying news, we had another desire for legislative protections that resulted in the Newspaper Preservation Act, which allowed newspapers to kind of in the same city enter into operating agreements to try to reduce their costs. Those also fell apart. Normally, the smallest paper was the first to die under those agreements. Many of them have subsequently gone out of business. And then in the 2010s, again, the industry petitioned Congress looking for mandatory licensing agreements to try to put in place other protections for the industry through a mandated licensing regime. None of those have sort of kept to the progress of technology. None have created durable and sustainable solutions to what is genuinely a crisis in local news. Now, I don't want to underplay that. It's real. But these types of legislative mandates have never created the kind of solutions that serve the industry well. And hey, I get it. I spent 15 years in the greeting card industry. Talk about an industry that's been disrupted by technological innovation. But Hallmark didn't say, hey, Facebook, we want our money back. They said we need to take our strong brand and our differentiated content and extend it into new lines of business to try to create our own innovation. So I'm sympathetic to the need, but this is not the right solution by mandating these kinds of agreements.
And so if we look at, you know, this sort of link tax concept, and it goes by a bunch of different names, I think, as we've discussed a little bit, and it's, you know, the specifics are a little bit different in different places, but and going back probably a decade, we start to see them pop up in Europe. But the ones that people talk about these days mostly are the one in Australia, the News Bargaining Code, as it's referred to, and then the bill that was more recently passed in Canada. So the one in Australia in particular is often pointed to as a success story. I am personally a little skeptical of that. I've seen some data that suggests it's not nearly as successful as some people make it out to be, and it often actually has had some problems. But Chris, I'm wondering, do you have any take on sort of
Yeah.
what's happened in Australia and kind of how that's played out?
I mean, strong feelings about it. If the goal was to keep publications thriving or keep them alive, it hasn't stemmed the tide. Publishers are still going out of business. If your metric of success, and I think this is the true right measure of why people in sort of legacy media keep talking about Australia as a success story. If your goal was to get publishers paid, then it was a success. And Canada was a similar success, or at least it looked so at first, and the devil being very much in the details has proven to be a lot more complicated north of the border. And I have seen reports from Brian Morrissey, who writes the Rebooting, sort of newsletter, does a podcast, talking about how actually publishers in Australia were treating this as non-recurring revenue. They sort of socked into a rainy day fund. Now that deal seems to be expiring, and there's thunderous noise in publications in Australia to compel them to come back to the bargaining table and re-up, which doth not sound like a functional system to me. But it was heavily cited in the run-up to the Canadian bill that passed. The interesting thing is that, no politician ever missed votes by standing up to big tech, which is the dynamic that we're seeing sort of play out both in the two CAs, right, in Canada and now California. The narrative being that standing up for communities and for journalism is just what's fair, and Google in particular, which somehow has become the sort of bugbear in this argument, needs to pay its fair share for the journalism that secretly makes its platform run, which is a lot of elision and nonsense, but certainly sells a quick and easy narrative. And in Canada, you had $100 million Canadian, right, per year set aside in a pool. And what raised eyebrows, I think, a few weeks ago was who Google picked as the group that was going to distribute this money. There were two groups that applied. One was staffed with people from the CBC and Torstar and the big sort of legacy industry, and the other was staffed by a bunch of independent publishers. Canada's largest foundation, the InSpirit Foundation, I believe, or at least largest journalism funder, is also on this board, as well as Erin Miller, who's the CEO of something called IndieGraph. She's a former publisher. IndieGraph is a profitable company, but it's certainly small and independent. That steering committee is making the early decisions about how to spend that money in Canada, and legacy media kind of doesn't know what to do with itself up there in that world. So it's been, again, the goal was never necessarily informing communities. That's kind of way down the list. It's a little bit like you've had these large places that have kept their profitability by sort of strip mining communities and pulling back reporting, but continuing to keep high profit margins. That's kind of the story of, news organizations that sort of took Wall Street cash or sold themselves to maintain this sort of centralization and maintain profitability. They certainly take out more from communities than they keep in. And now they'd like to keep that level of profitability, but they can't really hide anymore the withdrawals. This is where these terms of ghost newspapers come from, where you have like a title sort of running public notice advertising for meetings it no longer covers and no longer staffs because it no longer has a reporter there. Now they're sort of set up in these places to start getting redirected corporate money from Google to keep on not serving that community, which is kind of wild. It's like giving an arsonist more matches,
Yeah, I think the point that you're making that is really important and often gets left out of this discussion is because the news industry has changed so much over the last couple of decades, and so much of the so many of the newspapers in particular have been purchased by hedge funds and then sort of strip mined, as you said. We're dealing in this world where the internet has changed the way that people consume news, the way that people get news, the way that news is even reported on as well. And understanding how that all plays together with how the money is made, and who is making the money, and then this entrance of large hedge funds coming in, purchasing newspapers, strip mining them. And then so we get to this weird position where people are saying, reasonably, journalism is important. Local journalism in particular is really important, and we want to get important coverage of these things. But the entire news ecosystem is kind of a mess. And, if the only approach to it is, well, we have to just shift money from these large companies that make a lot of money to these hedge funds that are taking a whole bunch of money out of the system, that doesn't seem like a particularly good way of going about things.
Depends on the size of your company. I think it's fabulous for the hedge funds, right?
Right.
It's really demoralizing for my members who are the ones who got laid off or bought out or like took out a second mortgage to launch a news organization, sold their car. These are all things that I hear from my members who stepped into the breach where these folks pulled back. And it's really what it boils down to, and how it plays out is this is sort of protectionist, preservation in these worlds refers to systems that didn't really work for many people besides the sort of largest and richest places. Certainly over the last few years, I'm trying to get my members involved and interested in policy, and they would just rather see these legacy things like clear the decks. Like they want to be able to build, and this is hard for them to get a foothold. I think another important thing to remember is when we say advertising has moved, the types of advertisers have also changed greatly. Think about the types of advertisers that newspapers used to rely on. They no longer exist. Department stores, movie theaters, advertising, they don't do that anymore. That's not the nature of how this works. Car dealers advertise directly now. They don't need newspapers in the way. Advertising, it's also really tough, by the way, if you're a car dealer. I can say this because my family used to own car dealers, but if you're a car dealer, would you ever want your advertising running next to a story about an auto accident? Right? Somebody who searches for new car is a much better advertising target than the sort of imperfect science that local newspapers, which had a regional monopoly on a certain type of advertising, could exploit at the time. And that just isn't the case anymore. So it is, unfortunately, though, that level of nuance does not translate in a soundbite in the same way that, well, they took our advertising, we'd like some of that money again. And that's kind of how I think I'm seeing it play out right now, which is a shame because it's misleading.
Yeah. Mike, you asked about other solutions. I think Chris was exactly right earlier in this conversation when he said lawmakers entering into this have two motivations. One is genuinely to solve the crisis in local news by finding new funding sources or new policies. And the other reason is to break down big tech. Well, if that's true, those are conducive to two different sets of solutions. If you really want to break down the power of big tech, and in particular, the source of its monopolistic power, which is data acquisition, you would turn to a whole bunch of different tools. A national privacy standard would undermine the platform's capabilities to surveil us and accumulate that data and turn it into behavioral targeting. Antitrust enforcement and proactive competition policy would make the platforms less of these walled gardens and give consumers more choice and create more healthy competition. More accountability and transparency on their practices so consumers can make better choices. We at Public Knowledge also advocate for a dedicated digital regulator, someone who knows the technology and doesn't have to have these episodic bursts of legislation, instead has the agility and the expertise to keep up with the pace of innovation while still mitigating some of these harms. So a set of solutions against that goal. And then there are others, as Chris has described, that are alternative solutions for local news, whether it's tax credits, a whole menu that we could talk about that are also being considered.
I think there's also something else, like a third lane that's percolating through this that's also a little insidious, which is this idea that, and it shows up in our culture more and more because I think we're living in the shadow of copyright and people's expectation that if I have created something, I own it. And even more than that, like there's a lot of it's mine, it's mine, it's mine, and how dare you benefit for something that's mine without paying me? And I'm sitting here having created some news stories, great, and I'm seeing you somehow derive a benefit, and I can calculate that there's some money involved with this benefit where you're benefiting, but it should have been mine. And therefore there's almost like this morality play that's going on here to say if you benefited some third party from doing something that I didn't invent, you just went and created something completely new that we hadn't happened before, but I see you benefiting, that benefit should be mine. And we're crediting that view in an awful lot of context, but including this one, this idea that if somebody has created something and it is capable of producing any sort of monetary benefit somewhere, that we're like, well, that must go to the creator, but that isn't true. And that's not the way it was supposed to be true. So a lot of this is really sort of, there's an ethos percolating through this, which is actually, I think, quite toxic. Because if we divide up the world into what was yours, what was mine, we're all going to have our little fences around our stuff and we're not going to be sharing anything. And that's not good for the public interest. That's not good for the discourse. And that's not something that copyright was designed to do. It was designed to make sure that the public had access to information and expression. But the more you allow fences around it, the less that flow and sharing actually happens. So that's a problem.
Think about how much of these stories are really pure research too, and how many are quoting public records or quoting people speaking at public meetings, which is not
Right.
original
How much of
thought,
this is
original
actually
expression.
yours anyway? Like
Yeah.
you stand on the shoulders of giants to produce anything you do, and then you want to slam the door in any of the giants or smaller people who would like to benefit from the fruits of what just got created. So yeah, it's there's I think a really toxic ethos, and like you were just saying, it's kind of predicated on a fallacy that any one human plucked it from the state of nature, and but for them this piece wouldn't exist. And yes, we want to, good journalism, we want to credit and reward and appreciate and benefit from, but I think a lot of these proposals presume too much in that department. And then they change the rules of the road for everyone, because one of the other things that we're discussing is how, okay, we want to fund journalism, but then if we start to grant these monopoly powers and the power to build these fences, we have now decided this is how, if you're a journalist, you make money. This is it, because we've now made it impossible to find other monetization opportunities. We're deciding this for everybody, including, like, I guess your members, some of whom would say, no, I think I had some other avenues available for me. Like, please, let my links be shared. Let them be shared as widely as possible, because then they will come back to me and then I can make the relationship with that audience. And that's going to be more profitable for me if I have that control over it. And regimes like this prevent those relationships, and your members and any smaller media can't say, no, this doesn't work for me. And it takes away the opportunity for them to actually have something better. And it's deciding it for everybody in a way that isn't working. And let's talk about the long tail in particular, that even if you generated a big pool of money, and let's say you fairly set what the term should be, you fairly collected it, how do you distribute it? Even the most equitable solution, like the New York Times is going to have more readers than an independent publication. But that means that the publication at the end, we call it the long tail, because there's a lot more little guys at the end who have some sort of claim to the pot, but most of that money is getting diverted to everybody big and expensive, and there's not going to be anything really left for the long tail anyway. So you've cut off the ability of the long tail to find their own monetization opportunities, and they're not going to see the money anyway, because it's all going to go to the bigger guys who have, more clicks to report in and say, hey, give us those pennies for all those clicks, and you only get your handful out at the end with whatever's left.
Cathy, I think what you had to say about the ownership ethos is really interesting. What's equally interesting, perhaps, though, is that the Copyright Office itself has rejected the notion of expanding copyrights for journalists as a solution to this problem. When they were specifically asked to consider an ancillary copyright that would extend the rights of publishers in this regard, the Copyright Office pointed out how multiple the causes are of the crisis in local news. It is about hedge fund ownership, to Chris's points. It is about generations of technological disruption. It's their own inability or unwillingness to innovate. It is not driven primarily by insufficient rights. And they concluded that extending those rights is not going to be a meaningful solution to the problem.
Or consistent with what copyright was intended to do and their mandate. And just to then do the legal translation, I was talking in general about that right to say no, that power to say no, and that we have certain monopoly rights that we grant to creators where it gives them the right to say no to certain things. And like copyright is one of those limited monopolies. The new monopoly they wanted to create had the label called ancillary copyright, and they had to call it ancillary because it didn't fit under copyright, but they used the word copyright in it because it was going to behave in a way similar to how we kind of understand the monopoly rights that a copyright grants. So that's how that term comes up, the ancillary, because it isn't true copyright, and the copyright because it has to do with it's mine, here's my power to say no and shut you out. But the point being is it's new. They would have to create it because this is not a power recognized by law currently.
And there's I mean, this is a really great discussion. There's a whole bunch of like really interesting elements to this, which is also, to get around that, like people have stopped referring to it as ancillary copyright in most of the discussions I see, and people are trying to pretend that this is not a copyright issue at all. And yet I think, the reason, Cathy, that you're going to the copyright point is because it really is a copyright thing. And as Lisa said, there's fair use. We have precedent on this. These things should be fair use. And it also takes me back to another, Lisa went into the history of stuff going back to the 30s. I'd go back even further to the fights that were had about, I'm suddenly blanking on the term. The hot news doctrine is what I was thinking of, where people were saying like, oh, if I'm the person who reported this, nobody else should be able to report on this story because I broke that story first, as if there was some sort of property right in news. And we discovered very quickly that that is a really problematic concept, because anyone should be able, the news is the news. There's factual information there and people should be able to report it. And to make that news more widely available, you have to allow for it to be spread, and you have to allow for other people to report on it. So I want to turn the discussion a little bit to, as we're looking at the impacts of these laws, one of the elements that has come up a few times now, which we haven't discussed directly, but I think is important, is that you've had in some of the cases with other laws where both Meta and Google at times have said, we're going to stop allowing links to news. And there's outrage about this, and I've seen people get angry about it. But the simple fact is that, the nature of a tax is that you tax something that you want less of, because you're making it cost more, you're going to get less of it. So taxing links means you're going to get fewer links. You're taxing news, you're going to get less access, or taxing access to the news, you're going to get less access to the news. And so we're seeing some experiments with that. Meta did a little bit of that in Australia, and now they're saying they're not going to continue to fund news news efforts in Australia. We saw them block links in Canada. There's been some experiments now in blocking links in California. So I wanted to have some discussion on what is the actual impact on news providers when the natural inclination of these companies to say, well, if you're going to tax this thing, we're going to give less of it. What is the actual impact on the news providers when that happens? And Chris, I guess I'll start with you, but anyone can jump in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because you can almost divide that in epics, right? Like historical epics of traffic from platforms. Once upon a time, a healthy site would get about a third of its traffic from social audience. Largely, when I say social, I mean Facebook, and about a third of its traffic from Google. The only reliable sort of recurring traffic that publishers get these days is from Google, and it's interesting because with the sort of dawn of generative AI search results, that seems to be shifting as well. But the sort of grand bargain up until now has been that in exchange for this visibility on Google, publishers got traffic, reliable traffic, and honestly, the longer, because of the way search engine optimization rules work for publishers, the longer you're around and the more links you publish, and nobody publishes more links than traditional newspapers, which update usually hundreds of URLs sometime in the middle of the night. At least when I toiled in those shops, that's how it worked. The more you publish on Google, the more Google rewards you with traffic, especially long tail traffic. And so that's kind of what makes up that number for these publishers. What Google started to do when this particular bill that's up in California, the California Journalism Preservation Act, AB 886, which has undergone a not a facelift, but an entire sort of organ transplant en route to a hearing tomorrow. When it showed signs of life a few months back, 2 months back, I believe, Google started experimenting with throttling some traffic. Google, not Meta. Google started throttling some traffic for a limited number of California publishers for California audiences, proving that it could do such a thing. And implicitly saying, when it announced how the money was going to be distributed in California, that they were happy to continue to offer free traffic to publishers in California. So Google is very aware of this bargain that it feels it has made. And those publishers have grown to rely on that audience, large or small. They depend on this sideways door for new audiences, for discovery, and that means new members if you're a small newsroom and you have a reader revenue program, or new subscribers if you have a sort of defensive paywall or some kind of flex in there. This is essential audience because it's how people find you that didn't know you existed. And a startling amount of people under the age of 30 never think of a local newspaper when they think about information. They just don't. Or a local news site if it's a startup in the community, which is even more dependent on that audience because they are digital only and typically don't have money to put a billboard up or a cab cover up or some other kind of way of finding out about something, let alone buying traffic or other sort of sophisticated search engine marketing techniques. And all of that was sort of sailing along until the sort of AI revolution started taking over Google. And now kind of it becomes, we're sort of in the great unknown, I think. This bill is heading for some kind of activity and action tomorrow. I genuinely fear that if it passes this committee, Google will preemptively say, you know what, this isn't worth the hassle. Let's just turn it off in California. That hurts every publisher, and it hurts smaller publishers more. And it hurts ethnic publishers, Spanish language publishers, Black publishers, who all of a sudden, it's not only a threat to their business. Theoretically, in a state like California, which has sort of biblical acts of weather, if you're in Northern California, there's a mudslide and you can't find out accurate information because local news is blocked on Google. There's a real public health concern there. I'm very worried about. So yeah, there's a lot going on right now around access to information, access to good quality information in a state that sorely needs it.
Well, we had that with Canada, where Facebook wasn't allowing the links and the wildfires were happening and people really needed it. But there's a part of me that's like, go Google with blocking it, because the whole thing is so preposterous. It presumes where the value is, and it presumes that all the value is being created by the news publications, and not that there's some value in the platforms to be able to intermediate what they publish and connect it to the audiences they really want to have read it, and the audiences really want to be able to read it. That without having to pay Google and Facebook, we get this really important service out of them. And so I like when they do the blocks, because I like to kind of point out, like, have it be more visceral of, wait a minute, we were giving you this great gift for free, and you just kind of looked the gift horse in the mouth and killed the golden goose. Just to, there's a lot of barnyard metaphors that we can use here. And I think that the math is a problem, but yeah, again, it's there's this chutzpah of, like, how dare you stop giving me the free thing you were doing for me that I wanted to charge you to do for me. It doesn't, when you actually do the math of where the benefit and the value is coming from, it is not that that the platforms were doing something that was taking, or purely taking. It was doing something that was giving, and maybe even giving in to a degree that is really being underestimated, because it was really quite valuable for everybody.
And I don't necessarily favor the blocks, but I completely agree that the two value equations here are simply not reconcilable. The publishers and the broadcasting industry have done these enormous, estimates of what the value of this advertising is. In most cases, they deliberately exclude the value created of the traffic sent to publishers by all of these platforms. In some cases, the laws that have been written deliberately exclude the value of existing agreements between publishers and platforms designed to support news. And then we have the platforms talking about how, news is a very, very small percentage of their business, 3% in Facebook's case. They talk about how they don't run ads next to news. As a former advertiser, I know that can be the case for many brands. And so the idea that this is somehow a level playing field and introducing a fair exchange of value is really difficult to understand, given how enormous the differential is in their estimates of value, and how many provisions there are in these laws that are designed to exclude and cut out some of the value exchange that they have today.
Yeah,
If
and
I were to,
go
just
ahead.
one quick sentence. If I were to summarize what I just said, I think if you would miss it if it were gone, then probably you shouldn't have a program that deters it, because then it will go and you won't have it anymore. And that's why I like the blocks. Not necessarily that that's the state of the world I want to live in, but if that's what it takes people to recognize, oh, woe is me, I may have made a mistake, then I'm all for it. If it can sort of bring that reckoning, which for some reason before we caused the damage is not being apparent to nearly enough people.
Yeah, though it's not clear that that proponents of these are recognizing that they may have made a mistake after these blocks. And I will note that there was a recent study in Canada of the impact of the blocks on Facebook in particular, and what they found was no traffic decline to Facebook. So the idea that news was so valuable to them and so important that taking away news from Facebook would make traffic on Facebook decline. That did not happen. Traffic certainly did decline to various local news publishers. And in fact, what they found was that users of platforms often to get around these blocks would just post screenshots rather than links. And so, that doesn't really benefit anyone so much. It just sort of made things worse for absolutely everyone. So I wanted to shift the conversation now a little bit towards, we've recognized the problems and the challenges of these, of these kinds of proposals and these policies. We've discussed that the news business is certainly struggling and it is a challenging time, and we recognize that. And there are a number of different factors, some of which have come out here before. But I did want to try and talk about, what does or what should perhaps the future of the news business look like, because it feels like so many people are betting on this. We have to do this or else. There's no other option out there, and so I thought might be useful to have some sort of conversation. And again, Chris, as the publisher person on the panel, I'm going to start with you and just say, where should we be looking for solutions for the news business right now?
Yeah, and this is where I think, taking a step back, it's worth recognizing that the fact that there is activity like this sweeping the globe means there's broad bipartisan understanding that there's a problem. And that's the first step to getting sort of any solution. And they shouldn't really surprise anybody that the first organized response would come out of places that have enough money to hire lobbyists, which are the legacy industries. Therefore, the first solutions aren't really future friendly, I would just broadly say, right? Lion's vision of the future is basically a distributed network of small independent publishers down to the community level, where the whole is much greater than the sum of its parts, and where policy solutions can come in is making it easier for these places to launch small businesses. Sometimes that's by pulling the revenue lever, which is what everybody's sort of hammering on like it's a carnival game right now. But sometimes it's by decreasing the cost lever, figuring out ways that they can work together, easing regulation around the creation of small businesses. It's at the state level, these are small businesses and face many of the same hurdles and challenges every small business faces, right? Healthcare is too hard to get, too expensive. Media liability insurance, which is a must-have for places that are trying to take on tough coverage, it's too expensive. There's no great model for it. All of these things that are to basic plumbing infrastructure. Every digital publisher you see today is the equivalent of, it's a problematic analogy to say a sod house on the prairie, but really there's not that much. If you're a digital site that launched 10 years ago, you might be shocked how bad the technology is underlying these publications. And that's just digital only publishers. When I look at how bad some of the ethnic media's websites are, Black publishers, I mean, these are not models of efficient 21st century publishing technology. All of which is sort of poised to be revolutionized by AI. But here's the interesting thing about that. The answer to how the disruption of AI on traditional search, this was a very kludgy way of introducing friction and trying to get people to stop on a web page for a fraction of a second and increase their brand visibility. But the experience of finding out, let's say, what time the Super Bowl was, an article was always the worst possible way to get the answer to that question. If local newsrooms can leverage some of this technology and become answer services for their community and grow trust there, that seems to me to be a heck of a lot more monetizable than a collection of these antiquated articles written in a sort of outdated style that nobody under the age of 60 regularly looks at. I think there's great potential, but a lot has to happen and a lot has to go right between here and there, which is why we talk about, right, distributed, low overhead. We need to keep the bar very, very low. The bigger things get, as we have found, the harder it is to sustain them. So that's I don't know if it's a hope or tempered optimism or something, but it's what keeps me coming to the job every day, because we need to make it easier, cheaper, less of a hassle to get more of what we want in the world, which, by the way, isn't paying hedge funds and is informing communities in a smart way and leveraging the sort of best of technology to make that happen.
I think I love the idea about, like, you can be a media outlet and actually become a repository of information, which was kind of your original job in the first place, and do it well, do it particularly locally, or do it in any area of expertise where when people have a question along those lines, you are where they go to, and they're not asking Google, which, I mean, in even viewing Google in the most positive light, wanting to understand all the information in the on the world is much harder to do well than to get specialized things that can do it deeply. So if readers can understand, when I've got this, they have the place, they have their, I used to go to Yahoo for movie times. And granted, that's kind of a search engine, but it was really more acting like a publication. And I used to go there because I knew they had the information. And when I needed the information, they gave it to me, and they gave it to me well. And so next time I needed the information, I didn't want to go find a new source of the information. I kept going back to Yahoo because it had worked for me. And it worked for me up until the day then they just decided not to keep publishing that information in a useful way anymore. And then I had to go find another repository of the information that would work for me. But I think this works. And then you get that footprint and you get that engagement with the audiences, and then you figure out how to monetize it around it. But the other thing I wanted to say at this point was, I remember I was a former aspiring journalist that was a mass comm major at Berkeley before I veered off into tech and the law, and sorry about that. But I remember my teacher was for one class was Tom Goldstein, who I think ended up dean of the Columbia School of Journalism, and we were having a lecture one day, and we were interrupted because out on the street was a siren that just was blaring, and he was talking about how one day it would be really nice that when we heard a siren, would have a way to find out what was going on, and that was kind of sort of a standard of like good local news, good news that like you could find out about the world around you. I don't we kind of have that a little bit because we actually built like with public data repositories and citizen journalism and social media that you kind of can find out what happened now when you hear the siren, but it's all very split and disorganized. But I think it presents some opportunities because you can have there's a lot of news that we're now able to get for free via social media because we've got people who see something who now want to say what they saw, and social media is a mess and the search engines aren't great for it, so it's not particularly usable at the moment, but these are solvable problems and we have a way of finding that out. So there's a lot of news that we can get for free and don't necessarily need a business outlet to present to us. But then let's think about what's left, which we can't get for free, that we do need somebody who can make the investment in digging deeper, asking the questions, doing more research, the investigative journalism, the multimedia support, and then figure out how to monetize around that. So, like, the job of what we need media to do may be different than how it always used to be because we actually have now millions and millions of accidental journalists who kind of end up communicating news, whether they do it, cognizant that that's what they're doing or not.
And I'd enter the chat by reinforcing that this is a problem worth solving. It's not abstract or theoretical. There are hundreds of studies that show that communities that lose their source of local news see higher corruption, see higher cost, are less likely to engage in their local democratic processes. They are more polarized. They are less engaged. They are less likely to vote. So this is not some theoretical, distant future problem. This is very real, and it's a problem worth solving. I just don't think it's meant to be solved by making publishers even more dependent on dominant digital platforms. We've seen how that turned out in Canada. It hasn't turned out so well in Australia. And so thinking that we can solve this problem by matching might with might and making them even more dependent on each other is not the solution. Very passionate about what Chris and Cathy have said about local community news and information that serves its community in a real way, in a rich way that understands community needs. I think solutions like public-private partnerships, the idea of incenting hedge funds to spin out some of their news divisions into community hands through financial and tax credits may be worth exploring. I think there's a whole different set of solutions that are more likely to create the kind of news that serve communities well.
You have in Berkeley a fellowship program
Yeah.
that places early career journalists in, I don't know, 100 newsrooms across California. It's a $25 million carve out in the budget. And, one of my arguments in opposition to the California link tax was you've already created a California cinematic universe of sorts where you're putting first the needs of underserved communities, underprivileged places that have genuine need for organization, and trying to use state funds to allocate resources in a targeted way where they're most needed. I don't understand why you're going in a, Marvel versus DC. You're going in a totally different direction and just writing blank checks to enormous, like, the first draft of this bill was horrific, by the way. It defined local news as any news that was read by a Californian, which means like People Magazine. I don't know. Like, there was all kinds of like nonsense in the first version of the bill that got less bad. But still, at the end of the day, it is attempting to use the great California Reagan idea of trickle down economics, right? Pay the largest publishers, and eventually, theoretically, hopefully, good journalism will come out the other side of that intestinal tract. But I remain deeply skeptical.
Yeah, I mean, to build on what all three of you have just said, the argument that I've made for a long time is that journalism was really always a community building business, right? And I think people sort of falsely thought of it as a news business. And I actually think like the successful news organizations were ones that were bringing together a community of people, often sort of a local, regionally specific community around news. And that allowed for them to provide a bunch of related services, including providing news, but also classified ads and other local information, whether it's movie information or things like that. The disruption of the internet was that it allowed for other, millions of different kinds of communities to form in all different ways. And
Yeah.
that's really sort of the underlying thing that strikes me is what disrupted the news business. But then if we focus on the news business being just about the news and not about the community, you're never going to get that back. And just throwing a whole bunch of money at the problem doesn't change that. And I don't think will bring together people in a way that is particularly helpful or useful.
For like 40 years, newspapering was a fabulous business because it was the right combination. Like the reason you had like a Clarion Ledger in one town was because at one point in time there was a Clarion and a Ledger. Neither one of those was big, but it was a fabulous business when it was a monopoly. And for 40 or 50 years, you had instances where at a metro level you had really high quality journalism and it could afford to be really high quality. The LA Times was a great example of this once upon a time in Southern California. As Southern California was exploding in growth, the first version of the LA Times, owned by General Otis Chandler, wasn't a fabulous business, but it didn't have to be because he was selling real estate and running real estate ads in his newspaper. So the real estate business was the real business. And this is immortalized in the movie Chinatown, right? Like this is the story of how the LA Times wasn't phenomenally profitable. Then it was phenomenally profitable under Otis Chandler. Sorry, General Harry, whatever, something or other. It's the Chandler family is like legendary in California. I'm screwing the details up, but like it started out as not a profitable enterprise, as a loss leader for something else. It became profitable in this period where newspapers had an artificial monopoly over a certain kind of print advertising. Even in, like I said, morning newspapers are the ones that had it. The Hearst newspapers were afternoon newspapers. They eventually failed, but like this was where we started. In my generation, started to think that this was going to be a career path. I graduated from college in 1998. It's been downhill ever since. It took a real nosedive in the recession. That was the end of and what the iPhone was introduced in 2007, right? So this was what fundamentally changed how people got information. Up until the 19th century, the average newspaper circulation was 9,000. This is what is immortalized in the Constitution, which protects, freedom of the. They didn't say they had to be a profitable business. The kind of journalism the Constitution protects is the polemicist, the Federalist Papers, the horrific name calling. That's what our founding fathers were interested in protecting, not fact-based, which is just how it kind of when they were mass advertising mediums, they became anodyne, they became sanitized. That's the thing that we've never asked to stand on its own until now, to your point, right? We've never asked. It was a bundle. It was that news plus comics and stock prices and movie times and classified ads and department store ads and all these other things. Now we're asking news to stand alone, and they're trying to find somebody to foot the bill for that, and they've landed on this. Sorry for the history lesson. That was
No, I think it's actually really, really valuable. So as we sort of head into the last 5 minutes of this session, I wanted to just allow everybody a chance to kind of wrap up and to give some sort of final thoughts in terms of what are key takeaways that people should be thinking about as they're exploring this and understanding all the stuff that we've talked about so far. The idea that we recognize that journalism is really important and that there are real problems in that space right now, and we need good solutions, but that the approach of a link tax or a bargaining code or something of that manner has real concerns and problems. And so, Lisa, I'm gonna go to you first in terms of what are the key takeaways that you think people should be thinking about as they think about the future of online news like this.
Well, Mike, you just stole my headlines by saying this is a really important problem and link taxes are bad and all those other things. So the only thing I'll point out is all this focus on the so-called models of the Australian and Canada laws. I would really encourage people to look more closely at that. Any funds that changed hands in Australia was not the result of the collective bargaining that's in the JCPA. They were both Google and Facebook were never designated under that law. Those are private commercial agreements that do nothing to break down their core monopolistic products. Canada similarly invented this new fund idea. It was not the same premise that's being brought forward at the federal level. There's a twist on it in California now, but that law too does not solve the core problems we've talked about, which is the inhibiting of free expression and access to information on the internet that comes with forcing payments for links. Links are the basis of the internet, and they allow everyone on the screen and everyone in this audience to access and share information in a free and open manner. Let's not take that away.
Great. Cathy?
My history lesson, the class that I referred to date myself, was also in the 90s and really before the internet was even like a commonplace watchword. And one of the reasons I told you I bailed for being an aspiring journalist and ended up in tech and then later law was the internet really fascinated me because everything I thought I wanted out of going into the news business about this idea that you learn something and you share what you've learned. I just thought that the internet just made that equation so much more efficient and lived up to this democratic ideal of all sorts of people could learn things and share what they've learned with people. It was everything that fascinated me about journalism. And now it had so much more potential because we could all own our own presses. And I think we really, really, really need to keep our eye on that dynamic. This is not something to lament. This is something to celebrate. And when we look at these issues, like, yeah, okay, somehow we got to keep the lights on for whoever is learning about something and then expressing it. That is a problem to solve. But we really need to focus on, with a clear head, look at what our playing field is. That is the problem we're trying to solve. The internet is a tool with which we can solve it. And to break our love affair with the idea that this sort of regulatory model, in whichever way the terms end up getting written, is not the thing. Like, we need to stop being in love with this idea of link taxes. It's irredeemable in any form that it comes in. But that if you look more broadly about what do we want to do and what do we have to do it, there's some great opportunities here. So I think there's a lot of room for optimism, but not if we go down this rabbit hole.
All right. And Chris, you take us out with the final word here.
Okay, I'll be brief. It's not a local journalism problem, it's a small business problem. And the problems facing these businesses have small business solutions that government absolutely could play a role in solving. But let's be clear, the death of your local newspaper is not the death of local news.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks to all the panelists. And thanks to CCIA for putting this on and for everyone listening as well.